Good morning. It's great to see everyone here in person and online. We are very pleased to have this event around building industrial resilience with a little help from our friends, looking at how allies and partners can help build strength in the U.S. industrial base. And so for this, we're going to have a fireside chat with Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jesse Salazar for Industrial Policy, and then we're doing a panel led by my colleague Jim Hasek, one of our senior fellows in the center, and we have. I'll let him introduce those great panelists then. But first, what I want to do is, for those who are not familiar with the center is in the School of Business at George Mason University, and our goal is to be a nexus for government, industry, and academia to collaborate and address the real challenges facing government industry in the business that we do every day. And so we do that through research, education, and training, and then events like today. So we're really thrilled to be here. I wrote a white paper on this topic and then published a shorter op-ed on this, and Jim Hasek, our fellow, has written a piece as well on an aspect of this, which he published through the Atlantic Council. So we're very excited to have this discussion. And I also want, before we introduce Mr. Salazar, I want to let you know that we've got two upcoming events to put on your radar screen. One is on the 30th of this month, and it's on a very similar topic. It's on defense exportability, which is an area very technical, but it's about technology, security, and foreign disclosure. What level of capabilities and what systems can the United States sell to foreign partners and allies? And that is a subject which is very technical, but has a lot of attention. When foreign defense ministers come to the Pentagon to meet with the Secretary of Defense, very often, an issue is what level, is these technology issues. And so for that, we have Mr. Frank Kenelon, who was at SES in acquisition, technology, and logistics at the time, and a great panel. And that's on the 30th. And that will be same BAT channel, so it'll be here and also hybrid, but it'll be a different BAT time for all you DC Comics friends. And that's going to be, I think, 3 to 4 or on the 30th. And then finally, we have our conference, which we do every year with DAU, and which is set for the 3rd of November, and that's going to be at the Crystal City Marriott, and then it will also be have a hybrid option, a virtual option as well. So please sign up for those, and we look forward to it. So now to the main event. So we're very pleased to have Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jesse Salazar, who's the DASD for Industrial Policy, and he joined ANS, the Acquisition and Sustainment Office, in February of this year. And he leads the industrial base analysis that the department does, supply chain analysis, as well as foreign investment reviews, mergers and acquisition reviews, and the like. So prior to this appointment, Mr. Salazar led global external relations for the Advanced Industries practice at McKinsey. And he's previously served as the Vice President of Content Design and Communications at the Council on Foundations. He has a MA in history from Princeton University, which as a PhD in history, I'm very pleased to see, and then a BA with honors from UPenn. So Mr. Sal is going to make a few remarks, and then we'll move into the Q&A session. So over to you, Jesse.
Thank you. It's always funny when people point out that I'm a failed historian. So first, I want to thank everybody who put this event together, George Mason University, the Center for Government Contracting, for the invitation to speak with you today. I also want to thank Jerry personally for his thoughtful leadership on defense industrial base issues. As you can imagine, there are quite a few eccentricities to the defense industrial base, and so I've really relied on experts like Jerry and Jim and some others here today to help me to navigate some of the many challenges before us. The community of practice that's been created here is providing really valuable insight into the responsibilities that I'm weighing every day in my job. And with this dialogue, you're highlighting one of the most important, and that is the development of international defense industrial cooperation. Before I get into the particulars of our international cooperation, I'd like to outline some of the major issues shaping DoD industrial policy priorities. We've known for many years that American industrial and manufacturing capacity has declined. We have to address this, and I share the view of my predecessors like Ellen Lord and Jeb Nadner that we must onshore domestic defense capabilities. There's a reason that prosperous, strong nations pursue a dynamic and innovative manufacturing sector. Manufacturing growth has exceptional economic benefits. Today in the US, manufacturing represents just 11% of US GDP, but it accounts for 35% of American productivity growth. That 11% of GDP leads to 55% of patents and 60% of exports. There is no engine of innovation in the US that comes close to that of manufacturing. 70%, more than 2/3 of American R&D spending, comes from the 11% of the economy that manufactures. Additionally, domestic manufacturing advances our national security by providing supply chain resilience and the capacity to respond in the case of a national emergency. I recently traveled to Danville, Virginia, where a team that had been working on an unrelated matter was able to repurpose some of its equipment and use some of its know-how to quickly respond to the pandemic and create masks. That's a valuable and needed capacity. So regardless of what's happening elsewhere in the world, we have a responsibility to build our own industrial base. And that's what we've been focusing on, especially in building supply chain resilience at the DoD. DoD's industrial policy doesn't involve 5-year plans or command and control approaches. Instead, we believe that clear market signals and investment priorities will unlock the power of American entrepreneurship, technological breakthroughs, and individual achievement. Our procurement and research revolves around broad-based stakeholder coalitions and public-private partnerships that can strengthen defense supply chains and catalyze economic growth. This confidence in our national values enables a thriving marketplace, and with its sophistication, diversity, and capacity to innovate for the warfighter, the U.S. defense industrial base remains the envy of the world. Every day, people across this country are designing, building, and producing critical materials and technologies to ensure our armed forces have every advantage and capability they need. Our defense industrial base allows us to preserve our military advantages and deter our adversaries, and I'm grateful to you for highlighting how we can achieve our mission with our partners and allies. As many of you know, we've been taking significant action to build our supply chain resilience. We've begun the process of embedding supply chain considerations into the strategy and governance of the DoD. We launched a new supply chain resiliency working group to identify, mitigate, and monitor risks to our most critical supply chains, from semiconductors to batteries, and to promote critical enablers like an industrial workforce, manufacturing technology, and cybersecurity. In response to President Biden's EO on America's supply chains, we've initiated a major effort to focus on defense critical supply chains. We've been able to get great input from the House Armed Services Committee Task Force on Supply Chains, and we're pretty in sync with a lot of the recommendations that they have put forward. And we've already engaged many of our allies and partners on these efforts because we recognize that we cannot exclusively look to American sources for all the items we procure, and strategically, we see great value in building closer cooperative ties. I could talk about our supply chain efforts all day, but I want to emphasize that as we invest in our international industrial capacity, we have to be cognizant of adversarial practices. Increasingly sophisticated, well-resourced, and pervasive cyber attacks, including state-sponsored espionage, are being used to steal IP and disrupt business operations, threatening the rules-based order on which global economic competition relies. Adversaries are flaunting environmental and labor standards. State subsidies, among a range of other strategies, are allowing adversaries to dominate key markets. These practices target the US and its allies and present supply chain disruption risks. In light of these concerns, it's fitting that our response starts with our closest allies. The National Technology and Industrial Base, NTIB, recognizes that our national industrial assets include key allies, Canada, Australia, and the UK. We're likewise closely engaged with various other nations, including India, Japan, and South Korea, as well as our NATO allies, to secure supply chains, combat adversarial investment, and promote fair competition. all ensuring mutual access to everything from essential medical supplies to critical technology. Increasingly, we work with our allies and partners to instill the best practices needed to build shared supply chains that are secure and reliable, and apply these same best practices to both our own and our allies' industrial base activities. So as we think about crucial issues like interoperability, we have to be cognizant of how this will impact our allies and our ability to fight shoulder to shoulder. Using NTIB as an example for industrial cooperation, each of our NTIB partners have access to resources necessary to support our domestic industrial base. For example, Australia's sophisticated approach to rare earth processing could help us build capacity here in the US. Canada supplies high purity aluminum metal needed for fabricating space, military, and automotive products. Additionally, Canada hosts a germanium zinc refinery, which imports ores from an Alaskan mine. The UK's advanced development of batteries could help us achieve the interoperability we seek in our own battery supply. And their forging and casting capacity can help us get ahead on a technology where the US has significant need for development. I'm also pleased to see that these close allies are embedding industrial cooperation in their own defense strategies. Released in March, the UK's Defense and Industrial Security Strategy supports growth and investment in the UK's defense and security sectors so that they are able to work with close allies and partners and deliver the capabilities that we need. They identify NTIB as a major area for industrial cooperation. Our Australian partners increased their defense budget 3% this year in order to contribute meaningfully to our partnership. Despite COVID for the financial year, Australia spent the most on capital and sustainment since World War II. Their defense budget grows 22% over the next 4 years. 80% is for additional acquisition and sustainment. In March, I participated in the NTIB Principal Quarterly meeting. There, I heard firsthand our partners' interest in progressing the work of this important partnership and the efforts taken bilaterally to build and strengthen our industrial collaboration. Since that time, I've spoken with the White House, Congress, our interagency partners, and allies to expand opportunities to strengthen our alliance under the NTIB. The message we've gotten is pretty clear. All of us are excited about building a stronger, more embedded NTIB. For example, my team is evaluating all possible options to improve the effectiveness, flexibility, and speed of the Defense Production Act, especially Title III. One way is to augment sourcing possibilities. So broadening the definition of domestic sources under the DPA will ensure the timely availability of essential industrial resources to support national defense requirements. And we're working with Congress to make sure that we have that authority to invest in Australia and the UK. Another possibility is expanding the use of security of supply arrangements, SOSAs. This will reinforce integration opportunities with NTIB, although it need not be solely focused with those partners. The expanded use of SOSAs will bolster the security of US supply with NTIB partners and utilize existing connections to grow the capacity of critical industrial resources from our partners. I've read about some concerns regarding SOSAs from none other than Jerry and Jim. And I want to let you know that that was very helpful for me and my team. And we will ensure that as we build these agreements, we are really reinforcing our allied commitments. Through industry engagement, we'll work with our NTIB and defense industrial-based partners to complete the code of conduct, providing a list of products and giving the US DoD visibility into allies' industrial capabilities. This is the point where we have to get specific about what it is that we need and what our allies and partners can bring to the table so that we can build real partnerships of mutuality. It gives us the information that we need to really bolster our security of supply. DoD must increase engagement not just through government-to-government channels, but also with international industry partners. That's why I plan to meet with industry leaders from all of our NTIB partners. Just as we must partner domestically with industry and across the interagency, we must also partner internationally. And increasingly, our partners are seeking industrial cooperation as a key element of bilateral relationships. I've now had the opportunity to meet with a wide variety of our allies over the last 6 months. And in every single one of those conversations, the message has been underscored that industrial cooperation is an important element of the relationship. And as we continue to refine our approach in mutuality with our partners and allies, we should set a high aspiration. We shouldn't be looking to catch up to any of our pacing challenges. We have to leapfrog them, and we have to bring the very best of our countries to make sure that we can achieve our mission and defend our values. I look forward to hearing this group's ideas for how we can deliver for the warfighter. Thank you.
Great. Oh, yeah.
Tested on.
Okay.
But
please. Great. Well, thanks very much for those remarks, Jesse. That was tremendous. It was great to hear your perspective on manufacturing and on partners and allies, because it's an important area to focus on. So those we have a short time for a little Q&A. So if you have a question online, I've got an iPad here, and then we're also going to have a panel later, so we can address them there. I want to pull a little bit on what you talked about, specifically with regard to the NTIB and Title III. One of the things about NTIB that's been great has been sort of the government-to-government actions. A lot have been focused on foreign direct investment and, or CFIUS and those practices. But there's also been a little bit of kind of frustration a little bit on we've got the great goals of the NTIB, but what really, where's the rubber meeting the road in terms of how can companies that are based in NTIB countries compete for industrial capacity, because as you mentioned, some of these companies based in these countries have specific kind of competitive advantages over U.S. companies. And because we're all one industrial base, how do we kind of square that practically? Have you all kind of started to think about doing kind of DFARS rules and changes to make those kind of opportunities really concrete for partners and allies?
Sure. So when we initially talked about my appearance here, I had said that I was looking forward to being able to launch a plan for what we're doing to strengthen NTIB and where we think that can go. I have, as someone new to government, realized that things are not quite as fast as you might like. And
shocking.
Unfortunately, the short time horizon for launching such a significant paper is a little challenging. But I can give in broad strokes where I think we can go. First, I think we need to recognize the successes of NTIB, because I don't think a lot of that has been communicated publicly. But I think the foreign investment review efforts are one of the bright spots. Yeah. So through a lot of the guidance and professional sharing that we've done with the UK, they have now a new law and a new foreign investment regime that they're standing up, that began earlier this year. And so we've been meeting with them fairly regularly as part of an NTIB working group on foreign investment review to keep them up to speed with what we're seeing, and similarly what they're getting back. And at the same time, Australia has one of the most significant foreign investment review programs in the world. And so we work very regularly with them as well through that working group. And we find that there's a lot to learn, because in practical terms, we have to understand what the adversaries are doing so that we can really understand how to intervene and what the true beneficial ownership of some of these companies is, because there are lots of shell companies that need to be, worked through. And so we're getting really sophisticated in our approach. So that's one concrete example. And then in terms of the way in which we invest, so the DoD does invest in some of these NTIB partners. So I think, I can highlight our rare earths collaboration with Australia. The Prime Minister of Australia, Prime Minister Morrison, highlighted this as a gold standard of industrial collaboration, where we're working to bring some of their know-how into a facility in Texas to help with separation of rare earths. So we don't have to get into the rare earth subject. I know we have some rare earth experts here, but the US needs to build its separation capacity and its magnet development capacity. But where we can go with it, I think your idea of looking at the DFARS is a good one, and I think it's something we should explore very seriously. I think all stakeholders here, Congress, the White House, the DoD, are looking for ways to deepen this relationship. The Hasek task force very clearly signaled congressional intent around where they hope that this partnership will go. And I think that that's important. So we'll look at a wide variety of tools that we can deploy to make sure that that is truly a strong example of where we can go with industrial cooperation.
Great, that's good to hear. And I was really pleased to hear your comment about Defense Production Act, DPA Title III. The whole fact is that domestic source is defined in the law right now, includes the U.S. and Canada, that you're looking to potentially work with Congress to broaden that to different countries, because that's a great opportunity.
So we do have the capacity through the IBAS program to invest internationally. We've made some investments in Japan, we've made some investments in Australia, but the hope is that we have the flexibility through the Defense Production Act to, in the eventuality of emergency, respond quickly. Yeah. So I think that's the true benefit of being able to have that flexibility.
Great. One of the a lot of the concerns you hear from companies that are either they're based here in the U.S. but maybe headquartered overseas, is that some of these broad policy announcements kind of don't necessarily filter down to where actually the programs are developed and so on. So it sounds like if you do a DFARS effort, an effort like that would help really kind of concretize what you're talking about. So
yeah, I think this effort really began in earnest with the Executive Order 13806 that really highlighted some of the issues in the defense industrial base. I think that did a tremendous job in elevating the issue and getting people to start talking about it. So a lot of what we've been doing over the last few months is continuing that supply chain resilience effort by doing what I said earlier, which is embedding these considerations in the governance and strategy of the department. So now we have to translate a lot of these considerations into specific priorities. So, we know that this is a big challenge, so we have to identify specific priority areas where we'll invest. We have to identify specific enablers that are going to lift all boats across the programs within DoD. And then we have to develop the policy and guidance that that acquisition workforce will need in order to make decisions around industrial base analysis.
Mm-hmm. Great. I have a question here that's coming from the audience. How is the supply chain for critical components used by our military departments that are procured for non-NTIB countries vetted, especially in the areas of semiconductors? How do you, you talked about the securing supply chains. How do you practically do that to the degree you can speak about it publicly?
So this is where I have to be thoughtful about the classification level. What I would say is that we recognize that a number of our partners provide some really key parts of the semiconductor supply chain for the U.S. The DoD is a large consumer of semiconductors. We're about 2 to 3% of the market, but that is also a limited extent. And some of the things we buy are pretty eccentric. And so we rely on some of our partners to provide us next-gen capabilities, but we vet them through the appropriate security measures to make sure that they fit in our systems and are secure.
Great.
And it's something that we've really been looking at. I think there's been a lot of activity around some adversarial sources over the last couple of years, having technology that was embedded. And I think efforts to really highlight some of those practices have been helpful. And so there's a close lookout for adversarial sources of critical technologies.
It's great to hear some of the efforts that you're talking about. One of the things that you emphasize, and I have emphasized in my paper as well, is that these efforts by allies and partners are about strengthening the U.S. industrial base, right? So, and that is a big priority for the administration, both to strengthen the U.S. industrial base, U.S. manufacturing, and strengthen relations with partners and allies. Even members of Congress that traditionally have been skeptical about working with partners and allies participated in the HAS task force you mentioned on securing critical supply chains. But at the same time, the administration also talks about Buy America, strengthening U.S. kind of manufacturing only or first. So how does DoD square that circle in terms of communicating allies and partners, but at the same time, squaring that with Buy America?
Sure, I would say that we take Congress's approach, which is looking to balance the equities here. and taking a balanced approach. So as I mentioned, it is really important that we have a domestic manufacturing and industrial base. A lot of policy decisions and private sector decisions over the last 2 generations have moved a lot of that capacity out of the country. And that has forced us into a position where we are now reliant on some foreign sources for materials that we really shouldn't. I think 13806, did a good job of outlining what some of those risks are and some of the ways those risks can impact our warfighter. So what we now need to do is first gain visibility into those supply chains to make sure that we know what some of those sources are, and then equip people with the ability to look at that decision making. Now, we have 27 waivers for Buy American, and what I'd say is that it has been, from day one, a critical priority for this administration to make sure that our partners and allies have confidence in their ability to work with us on defense partnerships. And that's going to remain as we develop more of an approach and work with Congress on what exactly Buy American looks like.
Good. Anybody have any questions in the audience? I think we've got time for 1 or 2. Thank you for that. So,
Sure.
Mr. Porter?
My name's Scott Porter. I'm a failed history guy, but I did good in my George Mason B School classes. I work at Thales, the U.S. proxy at Thales, and I'm in the factory over on the Maryland side of the river. So first of all, one neat thing is that we are employing British and French and Swiss and Australian technology in some of the U.S. systems we're building. But I don't want to talk technology today. To be useful for you guys, before I came over this morning, I went through the factory and I got my manufacturing director, my finance director, my supply chain and operations director together. And I showed them your bio. And I said, hey, if I might say, Jesse, what useful input do you have for Jesse today? So what the team in the factory, and they're covered by Defense Production Act, just said, hey, could you just keep encouraging COVID, but this is restating the obvious, has really stressed out our supply chain. So the more access that we can get from both US and our international cooperation suppliers, please, that's great. Because one thing we're suffering from, and the finance guy hit me with the bottom line, he said, hey, Scott, when the supply chain's late, when we can't get those parts, when we can't get products out the door and get them through operational testing, you were kind of making this point. The various DoD programs folks, their procurement rules are still the same. So if we're late, we're paying for it. And so it's creating a financial challenge too. But that's my message. The longer y'all can keep those supply chains going on both sides of the Atlantic, it really would benefit us back up in the factory. Okay,
Thank you for that. I'm happy to respond. I think first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the amazing team within industrial policy, but also at the Air Force and the DoD at HHS that's been responding to the pandemic. The Defense Production Act, Title III authorities have been used significantly to create PPE, to create vaccines, to create additional biotech capacity here in the US. And I'm very proud of the work that the team has been able to do in responding to the pandemic. I'd also encourage any industry leaders that are on the phone to please encourage your teams to get vaccinated as soon as possible. Vaccines are a very effective way of moving through this pandemic, and I hope that we can be through it as quickly as possible. But it really will take all of us working together in mutuality to address that. And the hope is that we can also play a significant role internationally in building vaccine capacity and getting through this pandemic. Because as you say, it has created tremendous disruptions to the supply chain. But first and foremost, it's a humanitarian challenge, and we have to make sure that we're safeguarding lives.
Okay. One final question. So yeah, while you go ahead, go to the mic. While you go to the mic, I want to echo that. I used to, when I was in his office doing 13806 and doing Defense Production Act, it was funny how little known DPA was, but it's tremendous to see how that capability has just blossomed in the last year, and the response is doing exactly what it needs to be doing. So.
Yeah, and before I just want to foot stomp this. I think there's a general misperception about the Defense Production Act that it is slow, and it is not. We've been able to move quite quickly with it, and a big thanks to Anthony DeStasio, who's the director of our DPA Title III team, for building a team that's really working at speed. And big thanks to the Air Force as well. Cameron Holt and his team have really been exceptional at helping us build processes that allow us to move at pace for this pandemic response.
Dana Baylor with the Elwood Group Steel Forgings. One of the things that COVID has shown us is the vulnerability of the supply chains when we look overseas. Jerry and I go back and forth all the time, and one of the issues that's highlighted is the lack of capability capacity within the U.S. So at a time in the future, if and when the balloon goes up and we end up in a real fighting war, when we don't control the seas, we don't control the skies, we're going to be unable to utilize the current offshore supply chains. So until such time as we're able to build that same robustness, Jesse, that you've already talked about, we're in a deep trouble. One of the questions I have has to do with the critical supply chain. At 100,000 feet, how is DoD defining what is critical in the supply chain and what are the critical components? Over.
Sure. So let me take your question second, but address the first part first. So there are a number of industrial capabilities in the U.S. where we really need to invest as a country so that we have more flexibility in our domestic industrial capacity. I would say forgings and castings, to include additive manufacturing, machine tools, is an area where we really need to beef up our efforts. We have tremendous capacity in this area, but some of our adversaries have really been investing here. But these foundational industrial capabilities are really necessary in order for more complex things. So when we think about supply chains in the DoD, there's a tendency to go to big systems like the Columbia class, right? But at the same time, we need to be able to make sheets of metal. We need to be able to make big forged parts. We have to be able to, develop composite wings, things like that require us to have a sophisticated industrial workforce, which is why we're investing there. And then also a sector that is here and capable of doing things. So when I talk about leapfrogging versus catching up, I'm not asking for us to adopt, the machine tool sector of the 1980s. I think what we need to do is use these next generation advanced manufacturing technologies, which are transforming the private sector, in DoD production. So that's one of the things that I'm really prioritizing, is making sure that we're embedding these next gen technologies in domestic capacity, because that's going to enable us to leapfrog, and it's also going to enable us to create a market that's not only sustainable for the US, but globally competitive. Because we want things that are dual use. We want industries that will survive in a marketplace, because that's the American way. And so we need to have that local capacity. And your second piece was around what we considered critical. So we have a risk architecture that was created in the 13806 report.
Yep.
That I have continued to use. So there were 10 specific types of risks, and I won't go into all of them, but they're things like, exposure to foreign sources and, the ability to actually produce through a workforce. You might be able to name all 10 offhand, since I think you wrote that risk architecture. But I didn't see any need to amend it. And so we've been using that to identify areas where we have increased risks. So in the executive order from the White House on America's supply chains, there were 4 that were identified as critical. Those are batteries, advanced pharmaceutical ingredients, and strategic critical materials, and microelectronics. And so those are 4 areas where we already have developed plans for moving forward. And as part of that executive order, we're spending the year developing a plan for the other highest priority areas. And so we'll be making an announcement on that soon about where we're headed, because we've already submitted some of our plan to the White House, and hope to be able to announce that when we can.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Salazar, for your candid comments and discussions. And now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Hasek and the panel to continue the conversation. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
By way of, let's introduce, of course, as Jerry was noting earlier, I'm Jim Hasek. I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Government Contracting, and I've been studying government contracting to a certain extent, also international security for most of my academic career. So we have here, actually, I'll let you all introduce yourselves. We have Arun, first of all. Tell us a little bit.
Seraphin, work for Senator Jack Reed as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. For Senator Reed, I help him with acquisition policy, including industrial-based small business policy, as well as science and technology issues, IT, and other cats and dogs. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
No, thank you for coming. Ed, please, from British Embassy.
Morning, everyone. Edward Ferguson. I am something called the Minister Counselor for Defence at the British Embassy. So with our Defence Attaché, I oversee our footprint of about 1,000 military and civilian personnel across the United States. And I essentially own the relationship with the Office of the Secretary of Defence, so on defence policy, the nuclear relationship, and everything relating to technology and industrial cooperation.
And Peter, please.
Good morning. Peter Lengyel. I'm the president and CEO of Safran USA. We're the holding company for the Safran Group, headquartered in Paris. We're a pure player aerospace and defense tier one supplier for the most part. We have some capabilities that are as a prime, but typically we're providing our capabilities to our U.S. customers first and foremost. Boeing and Airbus are our number one commercial customers. We supply to all of the business jet rotorcraft groups, et cetera. We're on the James Webb. It's our Mears and our space lift out of French Guiana and Kourou. And we're just interested. We've been growing for many years now here in the United States. We were up to 14,000 plus employees coast to coast pre-COVID. And we're looking to return to that level of strength.
Thanks. So Jerry has written about this, a paper which prompted us to come together to talk. The Secretary was good enough to come give us the viewpoint from the administration and all the important, enthusiastic things that they're doing to build industrial resilience here in the United States, but with a little help from our friends. So Arun, I'm actually going to go to you last, if you don't mind. I want to hear from the friends. And I want to hear from the American outpost of the Friends to ask, what's your, let me start with you, Peter, because you said in our preparatory call, you had said a couple of things that I thought were interesting and actually sort of almost shocking to me at points. How is this working in practice?
Not so well.
Okay, tell us about that.
It's usually the case. I mean, there are policies, there's legislation that comes down that takes quite a bit of time, as Arun knows quite well. But then there's what we call in the Navy, I'm an old retired Navy guy, commander's intent, which is usually the last message that the battle space commander sends to basically tell everybody what to do and how to do it. It's not specific, it's not down to the tactical level, it is the grand strategy of here's how we're going to fight this war. And so as a result, as administration changes, those top level senior executive statements that are made, whether it's Buy American or whatever it may be, NTIB statements, anything that affects allied relationships, then it trickles down. And it ends up being decisions that are made not out of caprice, but I think out of well-intentioned desire by contracting officers and program executive officers to follow that commander's intent. I believe that this is what they're saying, so this is what we're going to write in the RFPs or the RFIs. And sometimes those documents are exclusionary. Sometimes they specifically exclude or even target foreign allies or foreign capabilities that hitherto have been allowed to and encouraged to participate and bring those technologies into the United States. That's where the difference between a policy and an intent and the actuality of government contracting can diverge. And that's our concern.
I think you had, particularly I'll ask you about this because it does not, I think, directly impact your company, but perhaps others that you had suggested that you had seen some things at the NRO and at the Army Department that were particularly disconcerting lately.
Yes, I mean, there were documents circulating, arguments, and I would say articles that have been written. Some of it's behind the curtain, obviously, so there are various reasons for it. And we fully understand that. Again, as a former, as a retired warfighter and attaché in Paris, we understand that aspect of national security and national interests first and foremost. The difference being, of course, is that when it comes to the point that it is actually contrary to defense contracting law in the United States, that CFIUS doesn't count, FOCI mitigation doesn't count, then why are we spending, as a foreign industry, why are all foreign industries spending billions on the acquisition of assets and millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, in FOCI mitigation if it doesn't count? That's the issue. And so that is where we are now from a standpoint of, to some extent, being the canary in the coal mine, saying that, hey, we're seeing things that are contrary to what we've been assured is not the intent. We're all being caught up in that net, and as you've said, of, I would say, targeted actions that are targeted towards specific entities in the geopolitical realm, and we all know who those are, to exclude them from the process and from participating in the market and from information going outward towards them. And we fully understand that. We've been, I would say, trusted partners of the United States government for almost 50 years now. And that's our role, is to I think to, and understand this, I will mention this and then stop talking. Every one of our foreign partners, all of our allies, have to pass what may be as rigorous or more rigorous in exportation requirements to get that technology out of the country and over here to the United States. Because as you know, once it enters into the United States and once it becomes part and parcel of a list of components on a US platform, it's ITAR controlled. So you're asking your allies to give up the international market for good reasons, for very good reasons, and make the decision to obligate those technologies and those capabilities more advanced than what we have in the United States more often than not, exclusively to US control. It's a gamble, it's a risk. And so in return, what companies like ours are asking for is the ability, with those controls in place, with FOCI mitigation, with cybersecurity IT infrastructure that complies with all regulations, is a chance to participate. And that's it. I mean, I think that's it in a nutshell.
So let me riff on one point you made there. I dare say that if the technologies in question weren't either better than what's available in the United States, or at least
Equal and
less expensive.
Equal and less expensive.
Yeah, it would be difficult to convince the acquisition bureaucracy that, yes, I would like that thing from France instead of that thing from Illinois, or wherever it might be. So you mentioned a lot about about technology security. I want to go to the friend now and ask, how is that working out for the United Kingdom? Trying to control trying to ensure the security of American technologies at the Ministry of Defense. We were talking about this, I think.
Yeah, so I think we are very clear that we would like to see much deeper, quicker, cheaper technological cooperation between the United Kingdom and the United States and other allies. We are very clear. We've just published our integrated review, which is our long look at our foreign policy for the next 10 years. And it's built on a strategic framework of 4 pillars. The first pillar is that we aspire to being a global power in science and technology, because we really see that as underpinning everything else we want to achieve in the world. If we can't maintain that technological edge, our ambitions more widely for influence and security and so on will be stymied. So we need to do that as a nation, but we need to do that with partners and allies. So our ambitions are high, and we are impatient to get things moving forward and to address some of the barriers and obstacles to that technological cooperation. We're very clear that the kind of critical underpinning for any cooperation has to be trust, and that trust has to be built on a confidence that we are able to protect each other's technologies. Now, of course, that starts with protecting our own technologies, and as Dusty Salazar was saying, we've been focusing on that very hard in the UK over the last few years, initially through secondary legislation to lower the barrier at which point the UK government could intervene, for example, in foreign direct investment transactions, but now primary legislation, our new National Security Investment Law, which is just coming into play, which really brings us much more into line with CFIUS as a kind of tool and a framework. But then there is also, protecting other partners' technologies where they choose to invest in the UK or where we are developing technologies together. US technology frameworks, we obviously have a lot of experience with, and we buy a lot of American technology. Right. I think we're buying about $32 billion worth of American technology over the next decade, and supporting about 56,000 American jobs in the process. So, I think we are an important customer of the US industrial base. But it is very challenging, and it is expensive, and it is slow. And so, some of the controls that we have to deal with in terms of US technology controls, we did a study about 3 years ago now. Baker Donaldson law firm did it for us, and they estimated, and it is an estimate, that UK industry spends around £460 million a year complying with US technology controls. Now, that's over 1% of our defense budget. And you can press to test about the numbers, but overall, it's a lot of money. And a lot of time, and some of that is about time and delay and missed opportunities. But we think that is at least a proportion of that money is money that could be better spent if we were able to essentially progress on mutual recognition that each other's systems of technology controls, they're not identical to each other, but actually they're adequate to the task. And we're very much in that conversation with DoD, with state, with Congress as well, to sort of press our case that really we need to be able to trust each other more. We need to be able to move on the basis of mutual recognition of each other's standards rather than imposing our standards on each other. Because that is the only way really we're going to reduce the cost, accelerate the speed, and allow us to be competitive with those we're trying to leapfrog, in Dazzy Salazar's words.
I think this is an old question that goes back. We've got a couple of history professors or history buffs in the room. Goes back about 120 years. There's a great book by a professor at Rutgers, Kate Epstein, entitled Torpedo, about the difficulties of controlling technologies and actually then controlling the intellectual property as well and benefiting from the intellectual properties in the development of the first undersea weapons, both in the UK and in the US, way back then around the turn of the 20th century. Because I think at the time, so here I'm playing panelist and I will do this very briefly, so I want to set it up for a question for Arun. There were impulses from the 19th century and even the 18th century. What we knew from people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, it's of course that we're all stronger if we trade and we cooperate. And there's also that 18th century aphorism by, I think it was Frederick William, that talking about Prussia, that, well, yeah, alliances are good, but sometimes we feel like one's own strength is better, up to a point. So when you're faced with these political and economic impulses, if I could ask Arun, in the legislature, can you walk us through how it is that maybe when they're asked to pass judgment on this in the legislation that leads to the policy, how do you think members of Congress talk about these things or think about these things and hope that their intent, their legislative intent, gets translated into policy?
First of all, I have to do my standard disclaimer to say that you're hearing the views of Arun and not the Congress or the Senate Armed Services Committee or any other elected official. In fact, some of the things I say in rooms like this aren't even my views. This is just a way to try out ideas on smart people and see what sticks. So, having said that, I would say when my bosses are faced with these kinds of questions, they turn over the kinds of things that Mr. Salazar and what you folks have been talking about. And everything is intention. There's definitely a drive to be pro-security, almost today you can say anti-China in your industrial policy. That's an overstatement, but that's one theme. The other theme is we need local jobs. Every one of my bosses goes and visits their local factories and their universities and sees the great things that are coming, and they love them, certainly more than the next senator over loves them. And they feel like they can contribute to the federal government or the defense industry, and your job in Washington is to help them contribute. So there's that. Most senators and congressmen over time, though it takes a little while to understand this, understand the grand tradition of working with our allies and all of the technological advantage we gain from that, all the security advantages we gain from that, the idea that they learn, it turns out that in some other countries, they may actually be better at certain things than us, and we should do everything we can to embrace and use that technology. That's something that's learned on the Hill, but I think quickly embraced. And then the idea that there's actually foreign investment creating jobs in your local states. I think people start to understand that as well. And so there's this value put on partnerships with our friends, whether they're NTIB, non-NTIB, or other. And so there's an understanding that we need to embrace that as well. And then the last point that's in tension is the Department of Defense, who comes and says, well, you gave me this huge mission to do and not enough money to do it. So I just need to get the things I need to get, goods and services, to execute that mission at the best possible price. And it's often disconcerting for a member to hear that from the Department of Defense because it's not exactly what they're hearing from other parts of the government, like the Department of Labor or the Department of Commerce or the White House itself. So all of that then has to factor into a member's head and their staffers' heads as they try to sift through a single decision. And so that's why we come out the way we are, which is kind of everything in tension and speaking out of both sides of your mouth. So I would offer to the community that to help us through these things, I'm always a fan of presenting either very crisp stacks of anecdotes or actual data that can then help a member decide, well, it turns out that this foreign investment is actually creating jobs. I didn't realize that. Or here are the real elements of interoperability that we can get, or common logistics that we can get that support the mission. But in more of these crisp terms, because it's very easy to go back to the simplest level and say, well, I need everything built in my district, my state. So that's why I appreciate, I think, most that so much of the community, the academic community, the think tank community, is sort of taken on these problems. And we're getting better information about these issues now than we ever have before. And I really appreciate that. And don't think that the work that you're doing is going unheard or unheeded. It's really important for you to continue to present the data and these ideas to us in a crisp way. And I urge you to sort of think about the quandary that my bosses are in when you make these recommendations. It's one thing to be an advocate for your position. You're smart enough to know it's hopeless. So you need to sort of give me a way through here that balances all those different constraints.
I want to first actually thank you, Dr. Serafine, for noting that there is a difference between stacks of anecdotes and actual data.
I'm not a failed historian, I'm a failed material scientist.
Okay. I want to go to a question because I think it builds off a number of things that you've all said from someone in our home audience. I'm going to rephrase this a little bit because I think that it was actually meant for the secretary, but it easily I think can be answered by all from Michael McGrath about concerns that all of these all the requirements for security, for visibility, for cyber compliance and what have you. Might be driving, we worry about this a lot, but is it a bigger problem of late, or are we not doing enough now? Worrying about possibly driving away potential commercial firms that have exciting technologies that they're trying to bring to us. So Salazar was talking about that a lot. What are you seeing, can I ask Peter, as an industrialist? Is this something we should be seriously concerned about, or is it just something that we've always worried about?
I think I think you'll continue to see, we're part of, we've joined with, have been for years with an organization that was until recently called the Organization for Foreign Investment, now Global Business Alliance. Their statistics are impressive from the standpoint of realizing what foreign investment does on a state-by-state basis. And you're absolutely right around, the people, members of Congress, we're in 24 states. So we have a lot of interaction with congressional staffs, members of Congress, et cetera. And it's almost, we have to start off every conversation with, do you know what Saffron is? Which is unusual. I mean, we're, again, pre-COVID, about 100,000 people, a $26 billion company, number 3 aerospace supplier in the world, excepting, the aircraft OEMs. And to start at zero and then build your way up from that level of awareness is a bit of a challenge, is what we always do. But we've consistently invested in the United States because it's the number 1 market for what we do in the world. When I started over almost 13 years ago now, we had, I think, below 3,000 people. We grew to 14,000 people. We spent
in the United States.
In the United States. We built manufacturing sites and repair sites, aftermarket MRO facilities from coast to coast, largely for wheels and brakes and those types of things. But everything, again, just going back to what Saffron does, we do everything on an aerospace platform from nose to tail, inside and out. So that ability to flex from a commercial market to a defense-related product is part of what we do. And we think that brings the latest technology from a larger market with larger R&D and IRAD opportunities to reinvest that. We're reinvesting upwards of 12% of our annual revenues every year. So a couple $2 billion invested in R&D for clean, green aerospace, et cetera, has great applicability across the board to the number 1 user of JP5 in the world. It's the United States DoD and Air Forces. So all those things that we're bringing to the table are, again, what I'm saying is keep that door open. We need that stuff here in the United States. And even if, worst case, as the one gentleman was saying, the balloon goes up and supply chains are disrupted, those are American jobs with American employees making American products by virtue of export technology from our allies. That's what we're talking about. Keep that door open so it can happen. And keep the flexibility, because when those components need repaired by our allies that are buying foreign military sales and adding to that 1% to 2% administrative fee that comes with an FMS sale, they can repair it in their own backyard. We're the number 1 employer in the region, the aerospace sector in Poland. We're in Morocco in partnership with our Boeing friends. We do wiring there, et cetera. We're across the globe and can service those things and bring better services to those end users than an American supplier can. And I think that those are all the advantages that we're talking about when we're talking about building interoperability. And again, as a former warfighter, just want to say, when you get to the war, it's too late. I mean, I see several uniforms out there, but if you were in Bosnia or even the Gulf War, not being able to talk on the same circuits when you're going after the same targets, I mean, those are the kind of simple things. Not having the same weapon capability or electronic warfare capabilities so that you can all accept the same type of mission risk levels. Those are the things that we're talking about. And if it doesn't happen here, if it doesn't happen by legislation or by policies, then it's too late when we get to the fight. That's what we're working for.
Let me, if I could, take that and direct it to Ed from the perspective of another Ministry of Defense. We heard all those stories from Gulf War, from Bosnia, from, I remember hearing it about Grenada, for heaven's sakes, and that was just, an American thing. And I think I don't hear those quite as much anymore. And is industry, so obviously we have NATO standards that, we try to enforce so we can all talk to each other, we can all operate together, we all have the same, PowerPoints and grease pencils and what have you. But is the industrial cooperation and a part of that in terms of, from your perspective in the UK, fostering that interoperability?
Yeah, no, I think it's a hugely important part of it. The fact that we are buying so much of our inventory, from US industry, US defense industry, obviously contributes directly to interoperability. That's why, we have 1,000 people embedded in every major US, military unit across the country, is to ensure that we are plugging in the right places and we are making sure that when we turn up on the contested battlefield of the future, we are able to, plug in seamlessly on day one, night one, in the most contested environments. And that's something we have to work at every day. And I think everything that gets in the way of that is an issue that we have to, we really have to focus on. Right now, we're all moving at pace to modernize our armed forces. We've just set out our blueprint for reshaping our armed forces for what we see as a changing environment. But there is also a growing risk of divergence as we shape those armed forces, particularly as the US thinks inevitably much more about the Indo-Pacific theater. We are also thinking about that theater, but we're more rooted in the Euro-Atlantic. We're going to have to work harder if we're going to stay as interoperable, as useful and usable alongside each other as we have in the past. We're not going to be in the same foxholes as we've been for the last 20 years, side by side in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, it's not going to be as intuitive. It's going to have to be much more structured and deliberate if we maintain that interoperability. And ensuring that we are able to share technology, develop it together, or at least ensure that it is, where we want it to be aligned and needs to be aligned, it can be. Where we diverge, we do so consciously and deliberately. That's going to be vastly important, and otherwise we will regret it. So industrial is a critical element of that, I think.
So thinking about that, and something that Arun was saying earlier about jobs, and I want to be on the record that I favor university jobs. I'm a big fan of those. I'm happy that you're thinking about them. But also thinking about something that Dana was talking about earlier with respect to interruption of supply in wartime. Okay, or just in the case of a global pandemic, we have these problems. There's a notion that globalization was first about the free movement of stuff, but it's also become about the free movement of ideas, and some of that's political ideas, but some of it's also intellectual property. Some of it's technological advancement. That we have sort of a global community now of academic and industrial thinking. Is there something of a model? You say you're deeply in Poland. You're obviously hugely in France. You're also in the United States. Is there something of is there potential for a model of, if you will, alliance-wide design and thinking about concepts of operations with somewhat distributed manufacturing and maintenance? We got completely away from that, I think, with respect to, say, almost completely away with respect to the Joint Strike Fighter program. We were supposed to do everything in Texas. I'm from Texas. But we now are concerned that that might not be the best approach. Is there something of a model to that people could get on board with, whether in the legislature, around the alliance, or in industry, as a way of onshoring some of activities without having to do everything in every country?
From an industry perspective?
Yeah, from an industry. Well, give us from an industry perspective.
Well, from an industry perspective, that's part of your, I would say, your sales pitch. It's part of what you're offering as risk mitigation for any PEO or program manager. That is, how are you going to sustain this long term? I mean, it's not all about the sale. Heck, most people, if you're honest, in the A&D markets, low margins on the sales, on the OEM care. It's on the aftermarket, as we all know, where most of our companies make their revenue. That obligation to life cycle, to lifetime type of policy for your customers is essential, and that global basing gives you that flexibility. Do you really want to ship an engine back to the United States when you're operating in the Middle East? I mean, is there something closer with a trusted partner? Say you have 35 program, allied partners, where you can get it quicker and send it into a place that's been cleared, that meets all the U.S. requirements for control of information, et cetera. And even if it's just a piece part. So from that perspective, I put that responsibility on the warfighters to be able to say, I can or cannot support this critical capability. And if it's in the strategic matrix, then it gets attention, and then it gets resolution. I mean, I think that's the quickest way to do it. And industry partners are going to be the first ones to help you do that. They're going to be the ones to say, what is our level of redundancy? And down to the site locations as we're seeing in the pandemic, there are some locations that, because of lack of vaccines or lack of transport, et cetera, that have put some of our programs at risk. And we're addressing that case by case. Think of it in wartime situation. You need that flexibility to send it anywhere that you can, or get that part or a comparable part from one of our allies. And I think that's where the industry partners, as I said, it's going to be a differentiator in the OEM sale originally, but it's in our mutual interest to address those things from the beginning.
That prompts another question in my mind, but I'll get back to it. Because I want to hear from Ed about the perspective from.
Just sort of on the back of that a little bit. I mean, I think some of the conflicts and dilemmas and balancing acts that Arun was just describing that feature in Congress obviously feature in your allies' countries as well, right? So, we all have what I see as a sort of tension between three potentially countervailing pressures. One is strategic, which drives us absolutely down the path of cooperation and collaboration, because we know we need to work together to stay technologically ahead. We know we need to work together to address some of the gaps and weaknesses in our industrial base. The second that can be in tension with that is the sort of political economic strand, which can be around jobs and growth and recovery post-COVID and all those challenges, and can lead you towards a path of protectionism. And then the third one is a sort of cultural bureaucratic one, which is that whatever we say at the strategic level, people are comfortable in their familiar territory and don't want to change. So, you've got to try and find the right path between those things. And our government is trying to do the same thing. We've just published a Defense and Security Industrial Strategy, Jesse mentioned it, which has tried to find that right balance. But it is important to us. We are, as I say, it is, if we can buy the same, operate the same equipment, that is obviously a key component of interoperability. But we also need to make sure we're developing jobs in our own industrial base in so doing. So the fact that 15% of every Joint Strike Fighter F-35 is built in the UK is very important to us. It sustains its skills and it sustains high quality jobs, and it's important to our economy. But similarly or conversely, or in some ways looking to the future, there are really interesting UK technologies being developed in UK companies who are reluctant to work with the United States because of this issue about fear of losing control of their IP. And that is a problem, because if we're going to leapfrog the competition, as we say, then we need the best technology, we need the best ideas, we need the cheapest access to technology. And so I think that sort of ITAR taint issue is a challenge, I think, alongside some of these issues around jobs. The only point I would make on jobs is, I actually think this circle can be squared, but it is about telling stories, as Arun was saying. The fact that British companies employ 56,000 Americans in America, but actually the number of programs we're buying into support about 160,000 American jobs, that's a UK story. But if we can actually put our story alongside other allies, you can get up to some very significant numbers that I think can be an easier sell to Congress. So if we're working with NTIB or working with NATO or with other partners, we have to win this argument that actually we are an important part of the industrial base, we're an important part of American jobs. And the protectionist route is not the right answer strategically, it's also not the right answer economically. So actually the tension is a false one in some ways, but we just have to win that argument.
And I think, that's the other thing that members of Congress and their staff are always going to look for is common ground. Is there anything we can agree on here to take steps on? And I think that one of the themes that's coming out here is there's a common ground on security, and there's a common ground on jobs in our country and our friends' country as opposed to our adversaries' country. And so, okay, that's a place where I can work with anyone on that sort of go after that issue. I think the other thing that I think you would find very few members of Congress who claim to be part of the bureaucracy caucus. So I'm for more regulation and slowing things down. And so whatever rules we have in place now, as imperfect as they are, we do actually want them to execute. And so, back to Mike's original question, that I bet you the theory behind all the security considerations that we've laid down, it kind of makes sense. I might have written some of it myself, who knows, right? It falls down in execution because the poor contracting officer who has to work with your company has to balance that giant strategic calculation with just getting through the day and doing their job. And so I think that's another place where we could use advice and find common ground, parallel to what we've tried to do in streamlining acquisition to invite in more commercial companies into the defense industrial base. Is there a set of activities, very concrete things that we could do to make it easier for the NTIB countries, to make it easier for other allied producers to work with us? And I think those examples that you're providing are exactly the kinds of things that led to the last sets of acquisition reform that were supposed to make DoD to be a more inviting customer for, let's say, a Silicon Valley company. So I think there's a space for common ground. It certainly can't all be done through writing another clever law. A lot of it is regulation, a lot of it is training, and a lot of it is protection from leadership, sort of a tolerance of some risk, which can't really be legislated. So I think that's another element of what's going to help my side of Washington move these things forward.
I am remembering former Undersecretary Ashton Carter's line when he talked about, when he rolled out his now 11 years ago, Better Buying Power initiative. He was asked about, how are you going to affect the cultural change necessary to bring this about? And he said, I don't do cultural change. That's too hard. And I thought, that's a remarkable statement from a guy who's actually a public policy professor. I mean, admittedly a PhD in physics, but a public policy professor at Harvard. If we are hoping for cultural change from the whether it's arm's length or maybe even a little bit closer distance of, say, international industry or international allies, what is the one thing or the couple of things that you wish that the Congress or the bureaucracy was hearing from you? And I'm kind of riffing off a question here that we've gotten from Joseph Boot out in in our own audience again. And he's wondering about, for example, the United States government's ability, is there an ability to leverage what industry knows and he's asking, in simplifying security requirements or any other way to try to make this one bigger, better, industrial alliance?
It's a great question. The challenge is, and there's the carrot or the stick. The stick doesn't exist, right? From a standpoint of, if you go too far with these things, as the examples I gave before. If everybody, I think most of the people in this room are old enough to remember the competition for the TX, now the T7 Alpha. First industry day for the TX was US only. Does everyone remember that? Which is hilarious when you think about it, because the three contenders ended up being a Korean company, an Italian company, and a Swedish company. Partnered with U.S. partners with obligations to create jobs in the United States and manufacturing
By the way, that was
capabilities.
a training jet.
Yeah, it's a trainer.
Training jet?
Yes.
US only.
The inter-service trainer jet, the TX,
No.
was the first industry day, was US only. Like I said, no one ever got in trouble for doing that. And I'm not advocating for some type of UCMJ or some type of court action for that, but I'm just saying, please.
Maybe a stern talking to.
Maybe a stern talking, maybe a letter in your file. But that's the level. No one's ever going to get in trouble by overclassifying something. And as a result, those decisions that are made by people well-intentioned, but perhaps misinformed or just out of an overabundance of caution, are going to label every slide classified, no foreign, et cetera, and there's never going to be any brushback. Just like, and again, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying anecdotally, members of boards of SSAs and proxies, and we've had them, will never lose their job by saying no to a business opportunity, simply because who's going to say otherwise? There has to be repercussions or some type of mechanism for industry to engage at the level to simply say, okay, that's not appropriate. We have things to say, we have meetings that we can contribute. Our people, our engineers know quite well that once we walk in with our business partners, whether it's Lockheed or Northrop or Boeing Defense or whomever it may be, or General Atomics, that once we reach a certain point in the conversation, we walk out. Unless it's part of our two SSAs.
So just to jump on that, I think what would be helpful for me and my colleagues is a more effective mechanism of telling good news stories and holding up people who do good things. And in some way honoring their risk-taking and giving them something. Washington is very good at spreading bad news stories, and my bosses hear them, but they like to hear good news stories as well. And especially, they do a really good job of congratulating people back home who get honored for doing good things. A theme of acquisition reform we've talked about over the years is oversight over overseers. And until we get that balance right, we're never going to have the acquisition reform and streamlined system and fast-moving system that we want. So my simplest, easiest thing to go after this a little bit is to just do a better job of holding up the examples of people who've tried to work within the system and done the right thing, and then get lauded for it, right? And get the opposite of the public executions that I do get to see occasionally. That's what I'm looking for.
I should maybe step in to defend the secretary a bit since he's now gone. But he did say that he wants to go out to have conversations with industrialists amidst all the NTIB countries, at least. Now that excludes Safran, I guess, but there's this maybe a bit of a clamor for all the folks who are not in the NTIB to get into the NTIB. Does he need to widen that circle? Do we need to widen that circle of discussion? We'll hear from the British Embassy last, maybe. I'm sorry. Well, no, quite okay. You can comment as well. I mean, because obviously the United Kingdom cooperates with a lot of countries, not just the United States and Canada and Australia, right?
I don't want my comments.
Sure, understood.
Disclaimer, speaking for myself and from my experience, to reflect anything that there's no criticism intended. It is more the observations of the few instances that rise to this level of concern on the part of foreign-owned industries like ours. The good news is, and again, this is something that is true. We're on over 80 DoD platforms. There's only a handful of aerospace platforms that we're not on. So it's tough to complain too much if you want to put it in that context. Our job, however, is when these statements come out, the first week of the new administration, increasing minimum content for U.S. government federal contracts, going from 50 to 55, with the plan to raise it to 75. That's going to be the minimum. It's like it's the opposite of the speed limit, right? It's going to be a de facto requirement, and so that's going to drive more investment. Let's be honest, it's going to drive more investment into the United States by folks like us who want to play in that market. But in the meantime, it creates a gap of opportunity for us. So we've got to adjust accordingly. That's why these instances, the onesies and twosies, where it comes up, where it seems to us to be clearly either unfair or short-sighted, that it's our obligation to bring it to you. And it's the same obligation that we have with Secretary Salazar, is to bring things that concern us to his attention, and equally to thank for certain circumstances where we're given the opportunity to contribute.
Do you have a comment?
So, I mean, we were very generously brought into the NTIB by Congress, and are very pleased to be there. I mean, I wouldn't therefore presume to comment on who should be in it or not. I think what I would say, though, is that it is challenging to make these changes, and trust is a really important part of that. I mean, I think what we have at the moment is a reasonably unique grouping in that sort of four eyes grouping that we have, four of the five eyes, if you like, where we routinely share high classification intelligence as nations. The UK and US obviously share nuclear programs technology as well, building our nuclear submarines together, for example. That is a good platform, I think, to have a conversation around why is it so hard to share conventional technologies, very often unclassified conventional technologies, but we wrap them up in process and bureaucracy and cost. So, I think it's a conversation we're having. I absolutely think that, the conversations we have in NTIB and the breakthroughs we all hopefully make in NTIB, we should look at those to see what can be applied to NATO and other partners as well, absolutely. But I think, there is some value in having a small conversation first, just practically, if nothing else. I mean, but it's not, I don't have a kind of a view on ultimate kind of shape, growth, or size.
Is there opportunity to, I did once ask one of your predecessors, I won't identify him just because I don't know that he wanted me to say this publicly, but why do we have a 4 eyes and a 5 eyes in a sense? We've got a 5 eyes, but a 4 in the NTIB. What happened to New Zealand? And he said, wow, well, I'm not sure we had a really good reason for leaving them off. I mean, it's not a huge defense industry, but at times there have been some, I've written actually in my recent paper about SOSA that there have been some really important technologies that have come from small New Zealander companies. Okay. Do we think that we've got it right? This hierarchy of NTIBs and SOSAs and RDPs, or is there another way of thinking about how the United States tries to arrange its allies in industrial concentric circles?
Yeah, I think most staff, I don't know that members have had public
Think about this,
discussions.
right?
Well,
Okay,
I mean,
yeah,
I'm sure they think
fair.
about it. We haven't seen a lot of public discussion about it. Most staff, I think, would say, no, of course we haven't gotten it right, right? But the idea that we have concentric circles or tiers of trust, and we're willing in some of those inner tiers to try new things, new kinds of sharing, new kinds of IP regimes, whatever it's going to be. I think most people would say we need to do more in that space. I think the other thing that these tiers and even the concept of 5 eyes created in a different era, it doesn't really rationalize multinational corporations and supply chains. The global flow of technology, especially information technology and software, just doesn't make any sense with the way technologies are developed today. So I think there's an openness to say, okay, if you're going to create tiers or circles, you can nuance that depending on the technology you're talking about, or you can nuance it depending on the country you're talking about. I hope that I don't know how you inform these things by data, but I'm hoping there's a way that there can be some rigorous analysis about, this particular technology, our trusted circles can look like this. In this particular system, it shouldn't look like that, right? And there's got to be, I hope there's ways to think about it.
I've thought of a question, but I want to go, we are fresh out from our home audience, so I'm going to, great, Dana, please, yes. Let's hear from you again. I wanted to go to, we do have people who are showing up in person again, it's great.
Dana Baylor, the Elwood Group again, forging manufacturer. And this goes to the whole panel. One of the issues that we face, we're making pieces parts that go to primes, that go to the government. Sometimes we're making parts that go to the Navy for ships and so forth. However, when you think about the average manufacturer globally, when government to governments talk, they talk about, or we all talk about cooperation. We talk about integration. The problem is those words mean nothing to a manufacturer because my boss will continually ask me the following question. And I guarantee he's asking his people the following question: what's in it for us? So as a manufacturer, when you talk about cooperating, now you talk about government to government, it's easy to say cooperation. We're going to cooperate on an international basis. And a lot of regulations, laws need to be modified to permit that. However, even if it's permitted, you get two organizations, two commercial organizations that don't depend upon a defense because they can't afford it. The only way you can do defense is through your commercial business to finance your defense participation. You can't stay in business that way as a manufacturer. So the question is, when you get two international partners together and you say, why don't you cooperate? Everybody in the room is selling. Nobody is buying. So from a government perspective, from a Senate staff perspective, how do you get there? You've got to stop talking only about policy and start talking about and integrate manufacturers into the dialogue about what's in it for us. How do you bring two manufacturers together and have that bad word profitability enter into the conversation so that then they won't just cooperate, they'll do business together for a long, long time. So it's use the KISS principle. We can talk about policy all day long. It doesn't get us anywhere. Until commercial entities start talking about how do we do business together so both get profit, get cash flow, and win, we're all just in the wind. Over.
Let me try to turn that into I'm going to try to sharpen the question a bit, which is to say, are we missing opportunities? Is industry missing opportunities because there's a bit of a muffler of policy on top of what would be natural for you to do? I mean, can you give us examples? Can you give us examples from the UK, perhaps, of how bureaucracy or legislation has been getting in the way? Or I could even ask, you were mentioning the drive towards 75, that we'd like, the administration has said, you know, we've got a kind of a 50% content rule. We're taking it to 55. We'd like to take it to 75. I guess that gets applied on a program basis for individual systems, which may or may not be a good way of doing engineering. I was speculating, though, maybe localized manufacturing is a way to go. There's a notion from the in international trade economics that, you know, if your country was actually big enough, maybe it would be efficient to have high tariffs because everybody else would have to play your game. So the United States has not been that big, at least since the 1950s, in terms of international trade. But is the United States that big in terms of spending on defense, in a sense? And that what you said, hey, if you tell us it's 75, we're going to invest in the US because we need to be here in order to get on the program. So tell me how that's bad for industry and how that's bad, but how that's bad, is that bad for the United States Department of Defense?
Well, to a certain extent, it's a zero-sum game. If we're investing here, we're not investing elsewhere, right? So the challenge is, how do you balance those assets and those manufacturing sites' production levels to match the market desires and you know what will sustain them, not just now but tomorrow. Part of the risk assessment that everyone is doing these days, as a prime or even as a tier one, is analyzing your entire supply chain for risk levels, right? And part of those risk levels are financial stability and how much they produce exclusively, let's say, for a certain market or a market segment. So if they're entirely a defense company, that's a risk. If they're entirely commercial, it's a risk. So we all have to balance those needs. The things, you know, again, unintended consequences. What would be the effect if there is global agreement on a minimum corporate tax? There's no advantage for home basing out of the Netherlands or any tax havens, et cetera, or incorporating in Delaware, whatever it is. If those things disappear, will that in fact have a salutary effect for defense supply chain? I would argue yes, it would be good, because then we will follow the market, we will follow the dollars or the euros. We'll be where you need us to be. But if there are other barriers that come up, again, going to buy American or not made here kind of syndrome aspects, then that's going to be, it'll price many industries and tier one and below folks out of a market with too much regulation and too many requirements. Because we have to be balanced. We have global customers. I mean, we're a commercial company, so.
We have a few minutes, just a few minutes maybe in which to wrap up. So let me go to the British Embassy and then to, not technically to the Congress, just to Dr. Serafine, but to see if you all could add any thoughts about all the conversations today.
So perhaps just to come back on this question about the last question. I mean, I do think it's really important to bring industry into the conversation, and you know, we are seeking to do that. Industry can be a little bit nervous about getting involved in conversations that might be perceived as criticizing government bureaucracy. We found, but we're trying to embrace. But I do think there are real world advantages to some of the things we're talking about. US industry can be excluded from doing business in the UK or other countries because we're pursuing ITAR-free, to try and avoid that constraint. Or conversely, British companies, don't want to sell their technology into a US program because they lose control of their IP, and there is a profit, impact on that. The cost of extraterritorial jurisdiction over retransfers and re-exports stops industry from meeting its targets because the whole process takes so long to get the approvals through to move stuff between government owners and industry, for example. I also think there are some interesting things we can be doing around supply chain resilience, for example, in kind of critical sectors where we know that there is vulnerability and there is this sort of boom and bust cycle of government procurement. I do think that there is a conversation for governments to have about how can we smooth the cycle by thinking multinationally rather than nationally about when we're going to be buying, forging, or whatever it might be. Can we smooth that cycle so that we just avoid that? And is there things we can do, for example, by addressing some of the challenges to skills mobility between countries, particularly when that becomes ITARable, that might allow high-skilled workers to go where the work is, and not to lose those into the sort of outside the kind of critical sectors where we need them. So I think there are some real-world advantages in this conversation. I do think it's really important industry as part of the conversation, so I'd certainly encourage industry to talk to us and others about it.
And I think that the comment was a classic example of what our bosses are faced with, the theory of strategic cooperation and economic theories of this is the way capital should flow, this is the way trade should lay out globally but I've had to lay off these many people because of whatever it is, foreign competition, uncertain demand. And so, how do you fight your way through those things? That's what we've talked about over and over again. So I agree with you completely. We need to think about those things. And that's, unfortunately, though, if we think about those things too much, then we drive ourselves back into this, I'll protect my district, you protect yours. You protect your country, we'll protect ours, right? That kind of situation. So I endorse, you telling that story and making it clear to decision makers what the implications are in practical terms of any of these grand notions. The other thing I just would throw out there, and we didn't talk a lot about workforce until just now, so it reminded me that, we and all of our allies have traditionally, how to say what the word is, benefited from the transfer of really smart people from other countries to ours, and we've used that to drive our technology and drive our business and drive our advancements. That kind of flow of people between countries and particularly to the United States is a huge advantage we have over our competitors right now.
There are remarkably few people who are trying to sneak into Russia or China.
Exactly. And so if we give up that
is not true about the US and UK.
Whatever we do, we need to understand what the implications of that are going to be for our economy, for our national security over the next decades. So one aspect of that is to continue to steal their best talent. The other aspect of it is to not make it so hard for people who we trust as our friends to share our smart people together to work on things. And wearing another hat, thinking about research programs in the Pentagon, it's amazing how difficult it is to establish even a basic research cooperation at a time when our competitor is investing hugely in these same fields to become the world leader in all of these important things. So that, just being on a university campus, will close with that, to say, there's a academic research, technical workforce, scientific element to this whole discussion that needs to be held up as well.
So social science, maybe.
That too.
Sort of. Thank you. I want to thank you all for coming here to George Mason University for this great discussion. I think we are we wrapping up? We are ready to wrap up. Please tune in to our September 30th will be our next event. We'll see you all then. And then October 12th after that, and then we'll be having our conference again on November the 9th. November the 3rd, yes, our annual conference with the AU. It's been wonderful having you. Thank you.
Thank you.